In the crumbling heart of ancient Rome, power was not only measured in armies, treasure, or decrees. Power meant the ability to bend reality itself, to force others to live and die according to a single man's vision. No emperor embodied this darker truth more than Nero. His reign was already infamous for cruelty, fire, and decadence. Yet within the folds of his story lies one of the most disturbing episodes in history. It was a tale not of conquest or war, but of obsession. A story of a boy named Sporus, whose very existence was stolen, reshaped, and hollowed out, until he became nothing more than the phantom of someone else. This was not identity theft of wealth or name. It was the theft of life itself. When the imperial guards eventually found Sporus, he was hiding in the wine cellar of an abandoned villa, clutching a small vial of poison in his shaking hand. He was not a rebel or a criminal. He was 20 years old, once paraded through Rome as the empress, and now cornered into a final choice: poison, or the spectacle of humiliation that awaited him in the Colosseum. That a boy could fall so far, that his life could unravel into this moment of desperation, was not an accident of fate. It was the result of one man's madness, beginning 3 years earlier, when Emperor Nero first laid eyes on a boy who resembled his dead wife. The year was 65 AD. Nero, the ruler of the largest empire on earth, had committed an act so personal, so shocking, that it rippled even through a society hardened by violence. In a fit of rage, he killed his own pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, with his bare hands. The accounts differ. Some say it was one brutal kick to her belly. Others claim he struck her with such savagery that she bled to death on the marble floor. Whatever the method, she and her unborn child perished in their private chambers. Physicians rushed in vain, but even they could not undo what had been done. Poppaea was not just an imperial consort. She was Nero's obsession, the mirror of his delusions. Chroniclers wrote of her ethereal beauty: amber hair that shimmered like strands of fire, skin pale as marble yet luminous, and eyes so large and striking that poets likened them to Venus herself. She was, in Nero's world, the embodiment of everything divine and eternal. And when he killed her, he did not simply lose a wife. He felt as though the universe itself had mocked him, daring to impose boundaries upon a man who believed he was born without them. His grief took on forms that horrified even Rome's hardened elite. Instead of cremation, as was custom, Nero ordered her body embalmed with such quantities of spice that merchants claimed Arabia itself could not replenish its stores for years. She was clothed in finery and sealed in a crystal coffin, where he could gaze upon her whenever he wished. Servants whispered that he dined with her corpse, that he spoke to it as though it answered, even consulting her on affairs of state. He preserved her chambers exactly as she had left them, down to the position of her hairbrush. Sleep became possible only with heavy doses of poppy wine, and he often woke screaming her name, convinced her voice was calling from the next room. But the madness deepened. 2 months after her death, Nero began to see her face everywhere, in young servant girls carrying wine, in the noble women who attended the games, even in the prostitutes lining Rome's darker streets. He would stop mid-conversation, transfixed, rushing to seize a woman's face, turning it toward the light in desperate search of the features he had lost. Artists were summoned in their hundreds to recreate her beauty, but marble and paint could never capture her. Nero's rages grew violent when they failed him, his tears childlike when he realized even his wealth and power could not resurrect her. And then came the moment that changed everything. In late 65 AD, while reviewing a tedious list of bureaucratic promotions, Nero looked up from his scrolls, and the world stopped. Before him stood a 15-year-old boy, recently promoted to clerical duty. His name was Sporus. To the emperor, it was as if Poppaea herself had returned. The resemblance was not faint. It was exact. The same delicate bone structure, the same luminous eyes flecked with amber, the same nervous tilt of the head. Witnesses claim Nero rose so suddenly that scrolls scattered across the floor. He circled the boy like a predator circling prey, his expression one of manic joy, a joy more terrifying than wrath. From that moment, Sporus ceased to exist as himself. He was no longer a boy of flesh and blood, but a canvas for an emperor's delusion. Raised in the palace, the son of a Germanic slave who had died giving birth, Sporus had been educated for administrative service. But none of that mattered. Nero forbade his name, forcing him instead to live as Poppaea reborn. He was dressed in her favorite colors, taught to apply her cosmetics, trained to walk, speak, and gesture she once had. Every deviation was noted, every flaw corrected. Servants later whispered of a boy who moved like a ghost, hollow-eyed, obedient, drained of will. But Nero's obsession demanded more than illusion. He wanted resurrection through flesh itself. And so the physicians were summoned. Some hesitated. They knew what was being asked was not a simple castration, common enough in Rome, but something new, something monstrous. Nero wanted Sporus transformed into a woman, threatened with death if they refused, promised riches if they succeeded. The physicians designed procedures that had never been attempted. To the emperor, this was not mutilation. This was victory over death itself. Thus began the most chilling chapter of Sporus's life, the gradual erasure of his body, his voice, his soul, until he no longer lived as Sporus, but as the pale shadow of Poppaea, Sabina, the woman Nero had killed with his own hands. Under the cover of night, on the eve of a surgery that would alter history, something remarkable and deeply unsettling occurred. Nero, the Emperor of Rome, stepped quietly into Sporus' chambers. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box, unassuming in appearance, yet containing an object heavy with meaning. He opened it to reveal a ring, Poppaea's wedding ring. It was no ordinary band, but a dazzling emerald of massive size, framed delicately with pearls. Nero slid the ring onto Sporus' finger, where it hung loosely, as if mocking the boy's fragility. Looking at him with manic certainty, Nero whispered that tomorrow would mark a rebirth. Sporus would no longer be who he was, but who he was always meant to be. He promised that he would love Sporus just as he had loved Poppaea. In that dimly lit chamber, Sporus, terrified and broken, found the courage to ask a single question. Would it hurt? For one fleeting moment, something almost human flickered in Nero's eyes, a softness that hinted at pity. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold madness of obsession. Birth always hurts, he replied, but what emerges is beautiful. The following day, the palace's medical wing became a theater of horror. A chamber had been prepared specifically for the procedure, shrouded in secrecy and dread. History, perhaps mercifully, does not preserve every detail of what transpired, but fragments of records, whispers from witnesses, and accounts left behind paint a grim picture. The surgery lasted for hours, a drawn-out torment punctuated by screams, so piercing they carried through the thick walls, echoing 3 corridors away. Outside, Nero paced endlessly, restless as an expectant father awaiting news of a child. At intervals, he called out words of encouragement, his voice ringing with manic pride, as though his presence could soothe the agony within. When at last the chamber doors opened, what emerged was not merely survival, but a reshaping of identity. Yet survival was far from guaranteed. Infection loomed constantly, threatening to undo the emperor's grotesque vision. The recovery stretched into months, grueling and merciless. Every movement, every breath was shadowed by the risk of death. Sporus had to relearn basic functions, his body no longer his own. And through it all, Nero hovered over him. He supervised treatments with fanatical devotion, carefully adjusting doses of poppy extracts to dull the pain, even lowering himself to change bandages with his imperial hands. To outside eyes, it might have looked like love, but this was no act of tenderness. It was obsession, an emperor tending not to a person, but to a creation, a living sculpture being molded into his fantasy. Each gesture of kindness carried the unspoken reminder that Sporus was no longer himself, but an echo of someone else. As Sporus healed, the transformation expanded beyond flesh and bone. Tutors descended upon him like an army. They were tasked with erasing the boy and constructing an empress. He learned to walk in smaller, swaying steps, the gait of a Roman matron. His hands were trained to move with deliberate elegance, to lift a cup delicately, to gesture with restraint. Most punishing of all was the voice training. Day after day, he practiced speaking in higher tones, forcing softness into each word, learning to modulate his voice until it no longer sounded his own. Tutors drilled him endlessly on intonations, even teaching him Poppaea's favorite expressions, her laughter, the subtle cadences she used in addressing members of the court. The transformation was not confined to manners and voice. Imperial seamstresses reconstructed Poppaea's wardrobe with obsessive precision, working from preserved garments to recreate her most iconic dresses. Jewelers reshaped her personal collection to suit Sporus' form, while perfumers blended rare oils and resins to replicate her favorite scents. With each garment, each jewel, each drop of perfume, Sporus was enveloped in a life that was not his own. The illusion was becoming complete, but Nero demanded more. Sporus was not only to look like Poppaea, he was to become her in every conceivable way. He studied her childhood in Pompeii, her first marriage, her rise in Roman society. He memorized her favorite foods, her opinions on poetry and politics. Nero would reminisce about moments shared with his dead wife, and Sporus was forced to respond as if he remembered them, too, weaving himself deeper into a life that had ended years before. Each day was a rehearsal for a role he had never chosen. 6 months later, the first test arrived. At a private dinner party attended by Nero's closest advisors and their wives, Sporus appeared dressed in one of Poppaea's distinctive purple gowns, her jewels sparkling in lamplight. The room fell silent. Wine cups froze midway to lips, words died in throats. Everyone had heard rumors of Nero's obsession, but to see it before their eyes was something else entirely. In the glow of lamps, with cosmetics expertly applied, Sporus resembled the dead empress so uncannily that for moments at a time, even hardened courtiers forgot themselves. The tilt of his head, the curve of his smile, the way he moved, all of it was Poppaea reborn. Nero beamed with pride, keeping one hand firmly on Sporus as he introduced him not as a freedman, but as his beloved Sabina, invoking Poppaea's family name. The courtiers, masters of survival, played along with forced enthusiasm, praising her beauty, drawing her into conversation as though death had never stolen her away. But the illusion was not perfect. Tacitus, writing years later, recorded the subtle cracks noticed by those who observed carefully. The hands remained too large, the shoulders too broad. The occasional slip into a deeper, natural voice betrayed the masquerade. More heartbreaking were the rare moments when Sporus' true self flickered through, his wit, his sadness, his intelligence. Witnesses recalled glimpses of a personality trying to break free, only to be smothered by the crushing weight of the role. Nero punished these lapses not with violence that could mar the illusion, but with icy withdrawal. Affection would vanish, replaced by threats to find another who could play the part better. Then came the announcement that shocked even Rome, a city accustomed to Nero's madness. In early 67 AD, it was proclaimed that the emperor would marry Sporus, not in secrecy, not as a farce, but as a full state ceremony, a wedding treated as legitimately as any imperial union. Declining to attend was unthinkable. Invitations reached senators, magistrates, foreign dignitaries. The city prepared for the occasion with grotesque normalcy. Priests arranged sacrifices, streets were adorned with garlands, and the bridal procession was planned with meticulous detail. On the day itself, Sporus appeared draped in the saffron veil of a Roman bride, his face painted with ceremonial cosmetics. A dowry was transferred, contracts signed with the same language used for any noble marriage. Nero played his role with disturbing sincerity, speaking the ancient vows, performing the rituals, even carrying Sporus over the threshold in accordance with custom. The feast that followed was extravagant beyond imagination. Peacocks stuffed with songbirds, wines from Caesar's private cellars, musicians and dancers of the highest order. Senators offered glowing speeches, poets composed hymns, and gifts flowed in as if to a true empress. Jewelry, household goods, even fertility charms, mocking tokens of heirs that could never be born. Behind the smiles and applause, everyone knew they were witnessing something monstrous. This was no longer mere excess, but a fundamental violation of Roman values, natural order, and human dignity. Yet no one dared speak. To dissent was to die. And so the empire watched, complicit in silence, as Nero unveiled his masterpiece. From that day on, Sporus lived not as himself, but as Poppaea. Each morning, servants who once attended the true empress now dressed him in her clothes, styled his hair in her likeness, applied her cosmetics, and bathed him in her perfumes. Every gesture, every word, every breath was scripted. His life became a ceaseless performance, staged for the pleasure of an emperor whose obsession blurred love with delusion. If you find this story as unsettling as it sounds, share your thoughts below. And if you want to uncover more of history's darkest truths, the ones never told in classrooms, make sure to subscribe. Because stories like this remind us how far power and obsession can distort reality itself. Nero demanded that his new wife accompany him everywhere, whether it was the theater, the races, grand religious ceremonies, or formal state functions. Sporus was placed in the empress's box at the Colosseum, carried through the streets in the empress's litter, and honored with the ceremonial respect reserved for an Augusta. To the Roman people, always eager for spectacle, this was something both fascinating and grotesque. A boy remade into the ghost of a dead woman. During Nero's extravagant tour of Greece in 67 AD, the illusion reached its most absurd height. The Greeks, eager to flatter their Roman masters, treated Sporus with the same deference they would an empress. He presided over banquets, sat beside Nero during his artistic performances, and even took part in sacred rituals normally reserved only for an emperor's wife. In Olympia, priests even prayed for the couple to be blessed with children, maintaining the charade in spite of its obvious impossibility. But it was in the private spaces of the palace where the horror of Sporus's existence revealed itself. Nero demanded not only that Sporus act as a wife, but that he embody Poppaea, his dead empress, in every detail. He was forced to mimic her preferences, repeat her private jokes, and even mirror her most intimate responses. Any failure to keep the illusion alive could bring either Nero's violent fury or his cold, devastating disappointment, a punishment worse than death to someone whose very survival depended on pleasing a madman. The imperial household regarded Sporus with a mixture of pity, fear, and revulsion. He existed in a liminal space, not man nor woman, not slave nor free, not alive in his own right, yet not truly the person he was forced to impersonate. Servants whispered about seeing him at dawn, standing motionless in the palace gardens, as if unsure how to exist when not performing. Escape attempts inevitably came. Yet how could someone so recognizable ever hope to vanish? His altered appearance, his feminine dress, the imperial jewelry he was forced to wear, all marked him as clearly as a brand. One attempt ended in disaster when his accomplices were captured and crucified in full view of his window, a brutal reminder that even death was not an escape from Nero's obsession. Perhaps the most twisted cruelty lay in Nero's moments of apparent tenderness. In his delusion, he seemed to believe he had truly resurrected his lost wife. He showered Sporus with gifts, spoke to him as though in loving confidence, even shielded him from insults. To outsiders, it might have looked like devotion. But what is love when one person has been surgically and psychologically broken to fit another's fantasy? Over time, the strain warped Sporus's mind. Servants reported that he began calling himself Poppaea even when Nero was absent. They found him conversing with mirrors, switching between his own voice and the forced feminine persona. The boundaries between the boy he once was and the role he had been forced to play blurred into nothingness. Then came the spring of 68 AD. Rebellions shook the empire. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state, and even the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Fleeing Rome, Nero carried with him only a handful of loyal attendants and Sporus. Even on the run, facing ruin, the emperor could not part with his artificial empress. Witnesses later described those final days in the villa outside Rome as a descent into madness. Nero clung to Sporus, begging him to die with him like tragic lovers of old. When news came that capture was imminent, Nero pressed a dagger to his throat. Sporus helped him guide the blade, a final act of mercy in their twisted bond. But with Nero's death, Sporus' ordeal was far from over. Now he became a living symbol, a prize for Rome's shifting rulers. Galba, the first to seize power, treated him with cold formality, but kept him dressed as a woman and addressed as Sabina. Otho, who had once been married to Poppaea before Nero stole her, treated Sporus with disturbing affection and even spoke of marrying him. His reign ended too quickly for that plan to be carried out. Under Vitellius, Sporus' fate reached its most grotesque chapter. The crude, gluttonous emperor saw him not as a symbol, but as a source of entertainment for the mob. He devised a public spectacle in which Sporus would be forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, abducted to the underworld. In this performance, he would be publicly humiliated, assaulted, and killed. Faced with this final degradation, Sporus chose his own end. Whether by poison or by opening his veins, sources disagree. But all agree he died by his own hand at barely 20 years old. The tragedy of Sporus is more than a story of Nero's madness. It is a haunting lesson about the erasure of identity, the destruction of autonomy, and the corruption of absolute power. His true self, the boy before Nero, was erased so thoroughly that even his real name remains uncertain. Sporus itself may have been a cruel nickname, meaning seed or sown thing. Modern historians debate whether his suicide was his only act of self-determination or whether small moments of resistance, the escape attempt, the decision to help Nero die, also represented his fractured agency. But what is most disturbing is how many were complicit: physicians, courtiers, servants, all sustaining the cruel fiction to protect themselves. Sporus' story is a chilling reminder of what happens when entire societies bow to tyranny, when reality itself is reshaped by the whims of the powerful, when human lives are twisted into raw material for another's fantasy. In the ruins of Nero's palace, buried beneath later structures, once stood the chambers where Sporus lived his stolen life, where he rehearsed words not his own, where the mirrors reflected only a stranger. The stones may still remember him, even if history has nearly forgotten. If this story has resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to uncover more hidden histories that reveal the darkest and most fascinating sides of the human past, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Sporus' story is not just a footnote in Nero's reign. It is a human tragedy that demands remembrance.